Emily Carter did not expect anything unusual that evening when she walked into room 214, carrying her worn leather bag and a stack of printed notes, because after 10 years of teaching literature at a small community college in Oregon, every class usually felt the same, yet something subtle shifted the moment she began speaking, as if the air itself had paused to listen. The class was filled with adult students from different walks of life, single parents, veterans, office workers, but one man sitting near the window stood out without trying, not because he spoke loudly or drew attention, but because he watched everything closely, as if he had learned long ago that silence could protect him, and his name on the attendance sheet read Daniel Brooks, age 32, older than most students but not unusual for night classes, though the weight in his eyes hinted at years that had not been easy. Emily introduced the course with calm confidence, explaining how stories reflect human longing, failure, hope, and survival, and as she spoke, she noticed Daniel lean forward slightly, his focus sharp, not drifting like others who checked phones or stared at clocks, and when she asked her opening question, why stories matter, no one answered at first, the room thick with hesitation, until Daniel raised his hand slowly and said that stories mattered because sometimes they speak the truth people are too afraid to say out loud, and his voice was steady but quiet, carrying a depth that startled Emily more than she expected. She nodded, thanked him, and moved on, yet something stayed with her, a faint awareness she could not name, as if a door had opened somewhere inside her without permission. The class moved fast after that, discussion flowing, and Emily taught with her usual clarity, but she kept noticing Daniel's reactions, how he underlined passages carefully, how his jaw tightened at certain themes of loss, how his gaze softened during moments of hope. Small details she told herself meant nothing, because noticing students was part of her job, yet when class ended and chairs scraped back, she watched him leave with the same quiet restraint he carried all evening, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt a strange sense of unfinished thought, like a sentence cut short. Over the following weeks, Emily maintained a professional rhythm, assigning readings, leading discussions, grading papers late at night, but Daniel's writing stood apart, not because it was perfect, but because it felt honest in a way that was rare, his essays sharp and reflective, written with someone who had lived through disappointment and still dared to search for meaning, and Emily responded with careful feedback, never crossing boundaries, but always encouraging clarity, courage, and truth, and she noticed how quickly he applied her notes, how each week his voice grew more certain, as if he were uncovering something buried rather than learning something new. Their interactions remained brief and formal, yet there was an unspoken understanding in those exchanges, a mutual respect that felt heavier than words, and Emily began to sense that Daniel was not just learning literature, he was learning how to stand inside his own thoughts without fear, and that realization unsettled her, because she knew how powerful guidance could be, how influence could change a person's direction, and she had learned long ago to guard herself against emotional attachment, especially after a past she rarely allowed herself to remember. Still, she could not ignore the way she felt more alive during those classes, how teaching him felt different, sharper, more personal, though she never allowed it to show, never lingered after class, never asked questions that went beyond the syllabus. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows and the campus lights glowed dim, Daniel stayed behind after class to ask about an assignment, his tone respectful, his distance intact, and Emily answered efficiently, but when he thanked her for her guidance, saying it made him feel seen. For the first time in years, something shifted inside her chest, a quiet ache she swallowed down immediately, reminding herself that she was his teacher and nothing more. Yet as he left the room, she stood alone for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the empty desks, realizing that without intending to, she had stepped into a story that was already changing shape, one where the first lesson had been given, not just to him, but to herself, and the meaning of that lesson had only begun to unfold. Weeks passed after that rainy Monday when Emily first noticed Daniel in her literature class, and with each passing session, something subtle but undeniable began to grow between them, though neither spoke of it, as if both understood the invisible line that separated teacher and student yet felt its presence like a current under the surface. Daniel's essays became the highlight of her evenings, arriving neatly typed, full of insight and emotion, exploring loss, hope, and the quiet moments that shape a person's life, and Emily found herself lingering over his words, reading sentences twice, marveling at how someone could express thoughts she herself had felt but never found the courage to write down, and she realized that grading papers had never felt so intimate before, that the act of reading his words was teaching her just as much as she was teaching him, though she refused to acknowledge it aloud. Keeping her comments professional, encouraging clarity, precision, and confidence while noting how well he captured the human heart, Daniel started to participate more in class discussions, sharing interpretations that were thoughtful and surprising, and Emily noticed the subtle changes in him, the way his eyes lit up when someone challenged his ideas, how his posture straightened when he spoke, how he began to trust his own thoughts instead of doubting them, and it made her proud in a way she had not anticipated, a pride that was deeply personal yet carefully contained, because she reminded herself constantly of the boundary between them. One evening, after a discussion about a story that explored regret and reconciliation, Daniel stayed behind while the classroom emptied, and he hesitated before speaking, his usual composure giving way to a quiet vulnerability that caught Emily off guard, as he admitted that her feedback had helped him see aspects of himself he had long ignored, that her words made him feel capable and worthy, and though Emily answered with measured warmth, she felt the familiar pull in her chest again, that same uneasy mixture of admiration and something deeper she could not name, and she caught herself staring at him longer than necessary, immediately looking away, trying to force herself back into professionalism. Over the next few weeks, their brief exchanges multiplied, questions about assignments, comments about literature, suggestions for improvement, but between the lines of their communication, an unspoken connection was forming, subtle gestures and glances that lingered longer than they should, the kind of moments that carry meaning without ever being spoken aloud. Emily recognized the danger of feeling so drawn to a student, yet she could not deny that teaching him had become unlike anything she had ever experienced, that his curiosity, intelligence, and quiet strength awakened something inside her she had thought dormant, a spark of emotional intimacy carefully hidden behind polite smiles and academic guidance. And even though she warned herself daily not to cross the line, the thought of Daniel's presence brought a warmth and anticipation she could not ignore. Daniel himself was changing too, growing bolder in his writing, more confident in class, laughing gently at literary jokes, making small observations that showed a mind sharpening and opening, and Emily found herself waiting for his contributions, noticing the rhythm of his thoughts and the cadence of his voice as he spoke. Aware of how every encounter left her both exhilarated and anxious, aware of the weight of unspoken feelings and the beauty of mutual understanding that never needed to be named, one rainy afternoon, as the campus paths glistened with reflection and leaves clung wet to sidewalks, Daniel handed in an essay on hope and forgiveness, and as Emily read it later that night, she felt tears prick her eyes at the clarity and courage in his words, realizing that she had helped guide him to see himself differently, to believe in possibilities he had once doubted, and she understood in that moment that teaching him was no longer just about literature, that her influence had extended into the essence of who he was becoming, while his presence was shaping her too, teaching her patience, empathy, and the quiet thrill of connection that defied explanation. Their interactions remained respectful and professional, yet each encounter carried a tension and warmth that neither could fully describe, a mutual recognition of the impact they had on each other. The shared understanding that what they were experiencing was profound and transformative, even if it could not be acknowledged outright. Emily found herself reflecting on these moments long after class, thinking about his expressions, the way he seemed to hear her when no one else did, and how effortlessly he had begun to trust her guidance, while Daniel likely carried similar thoughts, absorbing her encouragement and allowing it to change him, slowly opening a part of himself that had been closed for years. And though the boundaries between teacher and student remained intact, the emotional resonance between them deepened, forming a connection both fragile and powerful, one built on respect, learning, and quiet admiration. She realized that she was no longer just guiding a student through literature but walking alongside someone discovering his own voice and identity, and in return, he was opening a door in her heart she had not dared to enter, a space that felt like longing without expectation, a tenderness she could feel but could not name aloud, a careful closeness that existed in fleeting glances, soft smiles, and the subtle exchange of words that carried more weight than either admitted, until one evening, as they discussed a story about second chances and unspoken feelings, Emily looked up to see Daniel's eyes searching hers, and for a heartbeat, the classroom felt suspended in time. The air heavy with possibilities they would never speak of in that moment, and she felt the undeniable truth that their lessons for each other were far from over, and that the bond forming between teacher and student was no longer just academic, but emotional, intimate in the gentlest, most profound way, a quiet transformation that would shape both their lives long after the semester ended. The semester moved quickly, faster than Emily Carter expected, with the chill of winter settling over the campus and final exams looming. And all through the last weeks, she noticed Daniel's quiet determination growing stronger, his once hesitant voice now confident, his eyes brighter, carrying a mix of curiosity and something she could not name, as if he were discovering a part of himself he had long kept hidden. On the last night of class, the room emptied slowly, students filing out with chatter and goodbyes, but Daniel lingered, standing by the door with his coat in hand, and Emily felt an unspoken weight in the air, a tension that neither of them had addressed directly but that had been building for months, shaped by words exchanged in essays, comments, and soft glances across desks. He spoke carefully, thanking her for guiding him, for believing in him when he doubted himself, and she answered with a gentle smile, keeping her tone professional, reminding herself that boundaries were necessary. Yet she felt the pull in her chest again, that same quiet ache that had first made her notice him weeks ago, and she realized with a pang that saying goodbye would be harder than she expected. Harder because their connection had grown beyond the confines of the classroom, beyond literature and assignments, into something emotional, delicate, and unspoken. Daniel's gratitude was layered with vulnerability, a rare glimpse behind the calm exterior he always maintained, and Emily felt the impact of her role not just as a teacher but as someone who had inspired courage and belief in another person, and in return, she was reminded of her own capacity to care, to feel, to be moved by someone's growth, which was thrilling and unsettling all at once. When he paused, hesitating, Emily noticed the tension in his posture, the careful way he measured each word, and she understood that this was more than a simple farewell. It was a moment charged with years of unspoken emotion, learning, and mutual influence, a culmination of countless interactions that had changed both of them in subtle but profound ways, and she felt a mix of pride, longing, and the bittersweet ache of impermanence. She told herself that she must stay composed, that her role was finished as his teacher, that what mattered most was the knowledge, the lessons, the encouragement, and she carefully offered her parting words. "You did the work, Daniel. Don't forget that," knowing that saying anything more could blur lines she could not afford to cross, yet feeling every word resonate in the space between them. Daniel smiled, a small, careful smile that carried both satisfaction and a hint of disappointment, and for a moment, Emily thought she might reach for him, to say something she had held back for months, but she stayed seated, watching him leave, the room suddenly quiet, the echoes of his presence lingering, and she realized that her life, like his, had been subtly altered by their connection, that the influence she had on him had touched her heart in ways she did not anticipate, leaving her both exhilarated and sorrowful, aware that endings can be beginnings in disguise. The days after he left were quiet, almost painfully ordinary, and Emily returned to grading papers, teaching new students, yet Daniel's absence was a shadow she could not shake. His words from the last essay, the soft thanks, the way he had looked at her. It all lingered, a gentle reminder of the impact of guidance, of human connection, of the unexpected depth that can grow from simple acts of listening, encouraging, believing, and nurturing another person's potential. Months later, an email arrived in her inbox, from Daniel, his subject line simple, "Thank you," and as she read it, her heart quickened, recognizing his voice not just in words but in feeling, his note expressing gratitude for her belief in him, for helping him find his own confidence and courage, and the final line struck her harder than any message before. "Some lessons stay with us long after the classroom is gone," and she paused, letting the words sink in, realizing that teaching is never one-sided, that influence flows both ways, that the care and attention she had given him had also changed her, opened her heart in ways she had resisted, and left her wondering if some feelings, like lessons, linger far beyond the expected time. Emily closed her laptop, tears welling in her eyes, thinking about the nights they had stayed after class, the essays, the careful conversations, the silent moments that had carried more meaning than either had admitted, and she recognized that the story they had written together, though unfinished, was one of growth, transformation, and quiet emotional intimacy. a story where boundaries had been respected but hearts had still been moved, and she felt a deep, unspoken hope that one day, paths might cross again, that the lessons they had given each other could continue outside the walls of a classroom, where admiration, respect, and perhaps something tender could finally find its way into the light. 2 years passed after Daniel's last class with Emily, and life had moved in quiet, steady ways. Emily continued teaching at the community college, her days filled with lectures, grading, and the gentle rhythm of familiar routines, yet no student had stirred her thoughts the way Daniel had. Leaving a space in her heart that felt both empty and full of memory, a gentle ache that reminded her of the connection they had shared in those months of study, and how teaching him had changed her more than she could have imagined. It was a crisp spring evening when she attended a local book reading at a small downtown bookstore, the scent of coffee and old pages filling the air, and as she scanned the crowd, she almost didn't recognize him, yet the familiar tilt of his head, the calm focus in his eyes, told her instantly that it was Daniel, standing confidently at the podium, reading from a story he had written, his voice steady, his presence commanding yet gentle, carrying the poise of someone who had found his own way in the world. As the applause ended and he stepped down, their eyes met across the room, and for the first time since that final night in the classroom, neither looked away, a shared acknowledgement passing silently between them of everything that had happened and everything they had felt but never voiced. And Emily felt her heart beat faster, a mixture of joy, anticipation, and the lingering weight of unspoken emotions. They approached each other after the reading, and conversation began effortlessly, flowing from books to life to the years that had shaped them both, each word a careful step into a connection that had once been confined by roles and boundaries, now allowed to exist openly in a new context, and with every story exchanged, every laugh shared, the tension of the past melted, replaced by a warmth and familiarity that felt long overdue, as if time had been preparing them for this moment all along. Emily realized that what they shared was no longer the careful, tentative bond of teacher and student but a relationship built on respect, trust, and the deep understanding forged through months of growth, encouragement, and quiet admiration, and she marveled at how someone could change a life simply by listening, guiding, and believing, and how that same person could awaken parts of herself she had forgotten she possessed, a combination of courage, vulnerability, and longing that was tender without being reckless, strong without demanding, and profoundly moving. Daniel spoke about his writing, about the struggles he had faced, and Emily listened, offering insights and laughter, and she noticed how much he had grown, not just in skill but in confidence, clarity, and emotional presence, and she felt a swell of pride that went far beyond a teacher's pride, touching something deeply personal and joyful, the kind of pride that comes from seeing someone you care about flourish and knowing you were part of that journey. While he seemed equally moved, acknowledging the role she had played in helping him find his voice, his path, his belief in himself, the evening passed in a blur of shared memories, quiet confessions of what had mattered most, and the gentle thrill of rediscovery. And Emily realized that the lessons they had given each other were not tied to the classroom, to essays or assignments, but to life itself, the courage to trust, the patience to grow, the willingness to care, and the openness to feel, all wrapped in a connection that had been carefully nurtured, respected, and allowed to evolve at its own pace. As they walked together down the city streets afterward, the spring air cool and fresh, Emily understood that the chapter they had begun in the classroom had transformed into a new story, one where past roles mattered less than present honesty and mutual respect, and every step they took together was a step into a shared future shaped by understanding, gratitude, and the gentle thrill of emotional intimacy. She thought about the moments they had shared before, the papers, the discussions, the long pauses after class, and saw them now not as distant memories but as the foundation for something more profound, a bond that had endured because it was built on authenticity, patience, and the courage to care without expectation, and she felt a warmth in her chest she could finally name as hope, as anticipation, as the quiet excitement of a connection allowed to flourish freely. Daniel looked at her, a soft smile in his eyes, and Emily returned it, feeling the tension of past boundaries dissolve into something tender and honest, a mutual recognition of the journey they had shared and the possibilities that lay ahead, and she realized that this was what teaching could truly be. Not merely guiding a student to knowledge, but touching a life so profoundly that it leaves both people changed, enriched, and ready for the next chapter together. The night deepened, city lights reflecting on wet sidewalks, and they continued talking, laughing, and sharing dreams, each word reinforcing the understanding that what had begun as a careful, respectful connection in a classroom had grown into a meaningful relationship of equals, partners in curiosity, emotion, and life. And Emily felt a peace she had not known she could feel, a confidence that some lessons, some connections, do not end when a semester ends but evolve into something enduring, beautiful, and life-affirming. By the time they parted that evening, there was no awkwardness, no hesitation, only a quiet promise in their eyes that the story they were writing now would be theirs alone, shaped by mutual respect, shared growth, and the unspoken understanding that what they had taught each other, the courage to trust, the joy in discovery, and the warmth of genuine connection, was the kind of lesson that lasts a lifetime. And Emily walked home with a heart full of gratitude and anticipation, knowing that sometimes the most profound lessons are not about what you teach, but about what you learn from someone who changes your world simply by being in it.